All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Weather Where You Are. We are going to talk about the tropics as we are very near to the end of hurricane season here. Just a little over 3 weeks to go, and the tropics are actually still fairly active. We have a hurricane that is currently approaching the island of Cuba, and then another disturbance that is starting or at least trying to develop over near the islands of the Bahamas. So we'll talk about everything that you need to know on that front and what to kind of expect as we move forward when it comes to the 2024 hurricane season. It has been a busy one. Of course, we've had a couple of very impactful and devastating storms. We've had a handful that have stayed out in the ocean that you just might not even have remembered or heard about. So we'll kind of cover everything you need to know and talk about some of the things that are going on right now to kind of give you an idea of what to expect moving forward. First, we're going to talk about sea surface temperatures. These are really important when it comes to the development of hurricanes. Hurricanes are essentially heat engines. What happens is you have this spin start to develop in the form of a low, and all this warm water gets sucked up and turned into the cloud cover that makes the eye wall, and that releases something that we call latent heat. That's your fancy science word for the day, and that essentially fuels storms. And without that warm body of water, then these storms, one, won't develop or become very strong. So right now, just taking a look at the sea surface temperatures across places like the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and the Gulf, I want you to really focus on the Big Bend region of Florida, where you see that light orange color. That has clearly been a very hot spot for hurricanes starting in the beginning of the season with Debbie, and then of course we had Helene, and then Milton made its way up along the west coast of Florida, the Gulf Coast of Florida. So you're starting to see some of that orange color there. Well, essentially what happens is when you have multiple storms like this, it's pulling in a lot of water. So it's taking off that really warm top layer, and cooler water is upwelling from the bottom and making its way to the top. So when you have multiple storms kind of train like this or sit over an area in the ocean, that actually upwells cooler water. So that's the reason that you're seeing some of that cooler water along the Gulf Coast there of Florida, specifically near the Big Bend region, as that's been a place where a lot of storms have come. So essentially a lot of that warm water on the top has been replaced with cooler water from the bottom because they've had such a high frequency of storms so far this year. Taking a look at the Gulf of Mexico, the central Gulf still plenty warm. That kind of sweet spot when it comes to a temperature that's conducive for hurricane development is around 84 degrees Fahrenheit, and we are seeing that in some spots, especially in the central Gulf. Not saying that an 80-degree water temperature won't help promote the growth of storms or the development of storms, but it really looks like where we're seeing the warmest water temperature is in the Caribbean, just south of Cuba, also over towards the Lesser Antilles and south of Hispaniola, so the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And that is where we had Raphael form over in the Caribbean. And we have another disturbance that is at least forecast to try to develop, very low-end chance, over near the islands of the Bahamas. So let's talk about it. First, we have Hurricane Raphael, Category 2 hurricane as of the latest update from the National Hurricane Center around 11. This is forecast to become our next major hurricane, a major hurricane being Category 3 or higher. This is currently bringing tropical heavy downpours and hurricane force conditions to the island of Cuba, and this will continue to move on that northwesterly track into the Gulf of Mexico, where it will ultimately start to weaken because of a couple of factors that we'll talk about there. But Raphael can officially be crossed off the list. We did have Patty that stayed out over the open Atlantic, so that didn't bother us at all. We call those fish storms. That's not a term that is in the science books, but it's just a fun way to say that is stayed out in the water. The only thing you bothered were the fish. Tropical outlook, here it is. We do have a front that moved through a while ago, and that's kind of sitting off of the coast now, very far off the coast. And what happens this time of year when you do start to get a lot of cold fronts, you'll get lows to develop along those. You'll get kind of little pieces of energy to develop along those fronts, and sometimes those can take advantage of some of the spin in the atmosphere and turn into tropical systems. So this only has about a 30% chance of development. It is forecast to move off to the west, closer again to the island of Cuba, closer to the Bahamas, maybe even northern Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But nonetheless, this looks like it's going to run into a lot of wind shear. It's also going to run into land, which ultimately tears storms apart. So it's just going to run into a pretty bumpy region that won't really allow it to get any kind of legs. It doesn't look like this is going to develop into anything. Doesn't look like we'll have another named storm, at least here. Looking long range, we still could have another named storm or two, but looking long range, the only storm that really looks like it's going to have any impact potentially along the lower 48 is going to be Rafael, and Rafael's impacts will still be fairly minimal. Looks like it'll probably bring some rain to some of the Gulf states like Louisiana and parts of coastal Texas. Here's a look at Hurricane Rafael. As I mentioned, that will end up turning into strengthening, I should say, into a major Category 3 hurricane by tonight. There are already tropical storm warnings out in effect for the Florida Keys, but that's really, again, the one of the few spots that will have fairly minimal impact from this system. It doesn't look like anywhere is going to take a direct hit, which is good news. Essentially, a cold front's going to come in and keep this storm off the coast and also help weaken it. So you'll notice as we go into the weekend, into the start of next week, it will continue to weaken despite the fact that the water is very warm in the Gulf, especially the central Gulf. There's a lot of factors that go into hurricane development and depreciation. So you have, of course, the warm water. You need very little wind shear, which is that change in wind direction and speed with height. Hurricanes need to be vertically stacked in order to thrive. When you have that wind shear to come shake up that center, it becomes kind of off balance, if you will, and that helps weaken these storms, and cold fronts help with that. It essentially kind of slices the storms and gets them off balance and weakens them. And that's what's going to happen here as we head into Monday. And that will help kind of protect some of our Gulf states from getting any kind of direct hit from this storm, but some secondary impacts in the form of some rain and maybe some slightly gusty wind, some slightly more elevated wind expected as we head into the start of next week. Between that cold front and the storm moving closer, they'll experience some rain and also, again, some elevated wind starting next week. When it comes to, again, the setup, we're looking at unsettled weather here at home, but that front is going to help sweep Rafael out of our way. So that will thankfully protect not only us here in Georgia, but a lot of our Gulf states from that direct hit from the storm. But just kind of showing you that setup there. We have that front that's going to move in. That's going to offer us a little bit of rain today, especially north of the city. A few scattered showers starting to develop. But most importantly, in terms of tropics, that front will kind of help tear apart that storm and steer it away from us. We like cold fronts for that reason. If they can be timed out right, then they can push storms off. But we've also seen how they don't work in our favor in terms of Helene. You had that front approach, bring us a lot of very heavy rain, and then it happened to steer the storm right up the coast and bring all that devastation across the southeast. So sometimes fronts can work in our favor, sometimes they cannot work in our favor, just depending on the timing and how long they sit over an area for. When it comes to that secondary area of interest, essentially, that has a low end chance of development, you'll see it try to develop on this model, and I'll go backwards again and take you forward in time here. You'll see it try to develop over near Cuba, but ultimately it falls apart because, again, it's going to battle a lot of land and a cold front. There we are with the cold front saving the day again. So while it is going to continue to bring heavy rain potentially to areas like the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba's more than likely going to have some pretty decent flooding between the rains from Rafael and then from this disturbance. It's not going to have any kind of huge direct impact on the lower 48, which is good news. And as that front moves off the coast, the front that's protecting us from Rafael and that disturbance, that could potentially spark up. Remember, I talked about how sometimes pieces of energy can develop along those fronts. That could develop another system that we'll be watching. But again, that will be way out in the central Atlantic. So this front's going to sweep away Rafael, sweep away that potential secondary system that's trying to develop, low-end chance, and then keep any kind of further development off in the central Atlantic and away from us, which is all good news. Taking a look at where we stand so far this hurricane season, we have had a fairly active hurricane season so far this year with 17 named storms. So our forecast from the National Hurricane Center, from NOAA, I should say, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, say that 5 times fast, they forecast 17 to 24, so we hit the mark. 17, the average is around 13, 14, and so hurricanes, they were forecasting 8 to 13. We're smack dab in the middle of that with 11, and major hurricanes 4, but that is expected to be 5 if Rafael does ultimately strengthen into a major Category 3 hurricane, which it is forecast to do. So we'll update this again later, but again, on par, major hurricanes, the NOAA predicted 4 to 7. There we are at 4, probably 5, so definitely on par, and that is, again, above average for all those numbers. Named storms, hurricane, major, this was predicted to be a hyperactive season, and it has proven to be so. Now, again, not all the storms made landfall, not all the storms had a significant impact on the United States, but we talk about it at the start of every hurricane season. It only takes one, and unfortunately, we did have more than one this season. Hurricane activity naturally projected to go down. We had the peak of hurricane season in September. We had a really busy late August into September and October, but now we are starting to see that decline in hurricane season does end on November 30th. So we are nearing the end. Not completely out of the question not have some sort of tropical development beyond hurricane season, but doesn't look likely. You'll start to get, again, those cold fronts, which are not friends of storms. You'll start to see the water get a little cooler. You'll see just not as prime and pristine conditions for hurricane development going beyond late November. So we'll continue to watch the tropics as we continue to see storms develop or areas of interest from the National Hurricane Center. Again, some of our cold fronts can sometimes spark up some little spins along them, and those are always worth watching as well. But right now, nothing looks like it's going to have any significant direct impact on the United States. Of course, we have the tropical storm warning in effect for the Keys with Rafael, and then there could be some rain along the Gulf Coast states from Texas into Louisiana at the start of next week as Rafael kind of hangs out in the Gulf. But that storm lingering in the Gulf, remember I talked about that upwelling that cooled off the water in the Big Bend? That could definitely promote some upwelling of that cooler water. It'll take off that warm, it'll evaporate essentially that warm top layer of the ocean, and water from the bottom will then start to rise, and that will create a cooling effect in the Gulf of Mexico, which will also kind of help bring our activity on a downward trend as well. So as Rafael kind of hangs out over the Gulf, I'd be really curious to see how that temperature goes down. Right now sitting in the low 80s, which is pretty prime for tropical development. I'd be very curious how to take a look next week and see how that looks after Rafael makes its little turns out in the central Gulf. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here for Weather Where You Are. I hope you enjoy your day today. Of course, we'll continue to update you on hurricane season and on your forecast here at home over the next 7 days. First Alert Meteorologist Ella Dorsey will be on Atlanta News First at noon to give you the update on that, and hope you make it a great Wednesday.